Progress. This mic's got to come down a long way before every person steps on stage. There you go, Anish.
I'm not that short, but thank you, Rob. Hi, everyone. So I'm shit scared of standing up here tonight and sharing my story, not because of the public speaking aspect of it. So I used to be a competitive international debater. That's a real thing that existed, still exists. But I guess there's something fundamentally different about standing up in front of a room full of strangers and speaking about the foreign policy of Ukraine than it is to speak about your deepest and darkest insecurities. But here I am. Debating is a big part of my story tonight, but it's also a big part of my life, because when I grew up, my parents taught me that I should grab any and every opportunity like that with both hands and never let go. And the reason I learned that is because my parents sacrificed a lot for things like those educational opportunities for me and my brother. They did that when they made the very, very difficult decision, like a lot of migrant families, to move to a foreign country, to move to Australia, when I was about 10 years old. And in doing that, they decided to sacrifice their way of life, leaving a country they'd lived in for decades, to move to a country where they knew one other family, where they came on a 457 visa, so there was no guarantee that we'd be allowed to stay. And also for my mum, who sacrificed her entire medical career to come to Australia because the Australian government would not recognise her qualifications. So what that taught me was that education is really important. It's a really important thing to value and to take advantage of whenever you can. So I did that as much as possible because it demonstrated my appreciation for what my parents had done for me and my brother. So when I came to Australia, I did debating. I went to a selective school. I went to a very prestigious university, got a competitive scholarship, all the things that a good migrant boy should do. Because ultimately, the expectations that are placed on migrant families to live up to those standards and ideals of what should be successful are incredibly high. And for a lot of families, and you probably have heard this stereotype many times before, it manifests in either becoming a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. And unfortunately, that is just what the reality of it is for a lot of people. I was woefully bad at maths and science. I was half decent at debating, so my 12-year-old brain thought that the law was the only thing for me. That, and I really enjoyed Legally Blonde, the movie, so that kind of tipped me over the edge. So I did everything I was meant to do. I studied as much law as I could at university. I was living a glamorous life that people were envious of. I was going on exchanges, speaking multiple languages, president of not-for-profit societies, and things that would ordinarily be seen as successful and highly validating. But deep down within me, I felt like something was wrong. I felt like I was hiding a key part of my identity and my personality, and I was ultimately ashamed of who I was and what I wanted to be. And this was a familiar feeling for me. So I made, after years of thinking about my actions, reflecting on my mistakes, and even literally going to therapy, made one of the most challenging decisions of my life at that point. I decided to come out as a teacher. And when I told my parents that, that was probably the most disappointed they were in me, but perhaps only second most disappointed to when I actually came out to them as gay. So yeah, would not recommend coming out twice. But for me, genuinely, that shackling of expectations and the removal of that burden and that ability to be the truest version of myself is something that I can only compare to my experiences coming out as gay. And as much as I would like to package that up into a singular turning point that would easily translate into the plot of a Hollywood movie. That isn't necessarily how simple life is or can be. So for me, I guess my turning point was realizing that I didn't want to work a 9-to-5 job, making some very rich mining executive or law firm partner even richer than they actually were. My turning point was realizing that if I truly valued education and wanted to show my parents that I appreciated the sacrifice they made, I would go out of my way and give other people that same opportunity that I was privileged to have. My turning point was probably realizing that as a young gay brown person living in society, that I deeply valued social justice and the impact that education can have to progress our society, because I was sick of my colleagues asking me if I saw my family at the zoo, and my boss literally telling me jokingly to go back to where I came from. Welcome to Australia. My turning point was perhaps realizing that the teachers I had growing up inspired me and challenged me to be the best possible version of myself that no one else necessarily did, some of whom I have the privilege of working with today. But perhaps my turning point was realizing that my parents would cherish and love and appreciate me regardless of what I wanted to be, in the same way that they did when I decided to come out. And I acknowledge that a lot of this is very privileged, entitled, probably very much first world problems in a lot of ways, but I think it's something that isn't necessarily just confined to me. There are thousands of really bright young people around the country who are actively told to not go into teaching because it is something that is beneath them, or is something that is wasting their potential, or something that is just a backup plan for people. And I know that's something that a lot of people I know who've done teaching were afraid of as well. And my biggest fear is that we as a society are kind of hitting our own turning point on education, because education is very much in a crisis at this point. We have teachers who are significantly underpaid for the work that they do. We have very low qualification requirements to go into teaching, and we have a culture where people don't actually value teachers in the same way that people feel very entitled to offer an expert opinion about schooling just because they were in a classroom 30 years ago, yet never necessarily feel that entitled to tell their doctor what their diagnosis is just because they've been to hospital. And I think that's a big contradiction and hypocrisy that a lot of us are complicit in, myself included. So what can we do about it? I mean, there's a lot to be done. I feel like deconstructing that is a big burden to put on one person, let alone the people in this room as well. But I guess encouraging young people who are really good and maybe will be a great educator to actually consider teaching rather than just the traditional pathways that are deemed successful. Whether it's thanking your teacher or the teacher of your children for the impact that they've done, or even standing up in front of a room full of strangers and sharing a story about education. At the end of the day, for me, I think the most shameful part of my story wasn't the shame that I felt in wanting to be a teacher, but probably the shame in society for letting people feel that way for wanting to be a teacher. And I feel really humbled, I feel really privileged that I was able to reach that turning point myself, and kind of realise what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be and who I wanted to be. And my job as a teacher is just to help as many young people as possible to find their own turning points in life. Thank you.